My name is Maren Ellison, and 11 days ago, my father sat across a conference table from me and didn't recognize his own daughter. Not because I'd changed my face, because he'd never once looked closely enough to know it. He was there to beg my company for $2 million. I was there to decide whether to give it to him. Now let me take you back 9 years, to the night I stopped trying to make my family proud, and started building something they'd never see coming. I was 20 when I dropped out of Belmont State, 6 credits short of a business degree. I didn't fail out. I walked out, in the middle of my junior year, to take a part-time coding job at a payroll startup that paid less than my dorm's meal plan. My father, Robert Ellison, ran Ellison Hardware 4 stores across the county, a business his own father built. He had exactly one plan for his kids. My older brother Trevor would get an MBA and inherit the company. I would marry well, or at least stop embarrassing him at Rotary Club dinners. When I told him about the startup, he didn't yell. That was almost worse. He just nodded slowly, like a man confirming something he'd already decided about you a long time ago. "So you're throwing away a real future," he said, to answer phones for some app. I wasn't answering phones. I was writing the payroll tax logic that company still runs on today. But explaining that to my father was like explaining color to someone who'd already decided not to look. My mother, Carol, was gentler about it, which somehow cut deeper. "We just want you to have something stable, honey," she'd say, while hanging Trevor's newest certificate regional business leader, under 30 in the hallway, right next to the stairs, where everyone had to walk past it. I stopped correcting them. I stopped explaining. Somewhere around year 2, I stopped talking about work at all. Every Thanksgiving, Trevor would talk about store expansions and quarterly numbers, and I would get asked, gently, mockingly, "So, are you still doing the computer thing?" I always said yes. I never said what the computer thing had become. Here's what I want to ask you. Has anyone in your life ever decided who you were so early and so completely that they stopped being able to see who you'd actually turned into? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. By year 4, the computer thing had a name, Norlight. We built payroll and HR infrastructure for small and mid-sized businesses, the unglamorous plumbing that quietly moves money from a company's account into its employees' pockets every 2 weeks. Boring. Essential. Extremely profitable, if you do it right. I didn't use my full name on anything public-facing. Partly because Ellison already meant something in our town, and I didn't want Trevor's hardware store customers Googling me and finding my father before they found my company. Partly, if I'm honest, because some small, stubborn part of me didn't want my family to know until it was undeniable. I went by M. Ellison in filings. Norlight's public face was our COO, a sharp, warm woman named Priya Anand, who did every interview, every panel, every press photo. I stayed in the building, writing code, then later, signing checks. Nobody outside the company knew what I looked like. That wasn't an accident. That was a decision I made and kept remaking, year after year, every time I thought about calling my dad and telling him the truth. By year 7, Norlight processed payroll for over 11,000 small businesses. We had 90 employees of our own. I bought a modest house 40 minutes from my parents, told them it was a rental, and kept driving my 7-year-old Civic to family dinners so nothing would look different. I want to be clear, I wasn't hiding out of shame. I was hiding because I'd learned, the hard way, that my family's approval had a price tag, and the price was letting them take credit, take control, or both. I'd watched it happen to Trevor his whole life. Every win he had was really Dad's win, retold at dinner as proof of Dad's parenting. I didn't want that for the one thing I'd built entirely myself. So I let them believe I was still just doing the computer thing. I let Trevor make his jokes. I let my mother sigh a little every time someone asked what I did for a living. I didn't know, back then, that the distance I was building for protection was about to become the exact thing that saved my family's business. The trouble at Ellison Hardware started 18 months ago, though I didn't hear about it directly. I heard about it the way I heard everything from my family now, secondhand, filtered, always arriving late. 2 big box stores opened within 9 miles of our town in the same year. Ellison Hardware's revenue dropped 30% in under 2 years. My father, who'd run the business on instinct and handshake deals for 3 decades, had never modernized payroll, inventory, or scheduling. He was bleeding money on inefficiency he couldn't even see, because he'd never had to look. Trevor, to his credit, tried to warn him. He'd learned enough in his MBA program to know the store needed new systems, needed to cut costs somewhere smarter than just employee hours. But my father doesn't take advice from his son any better than he took it from his daughter. He just does things his way, a little slower each year, until the way stops working at all. By the time they came looking for outside help, Ellison Hardware was 3 payroll cycles from missing paychecks entirely. My father, for the first time in his life, needed someone else's money to survive. He didn't go to a bank. His credit was already stretched too thin for that. He went to a business consultant recommended by a Rotary contact, who told him the fastest fix wasn't a loan, it was outsourcing payroll and operations to a company that could absorb the cost and complexity in exchange for a stake and a repayment structure. The consultant set up a meeting with a payroll and operations firm that specialized in exactly this kind of rescue for small regional retailers. That firm was Norlight. My father had no idea. Neither did Trevor. Neither, for that matter, did the junior account manager who first took the meeting request and passed it up the chain, completely unaware that the surname on the intake form, Ellison, belonged to the family of the woman who owned the company. I found out on a Tuesday afternoon, reviewing the week's incoming accounts with Priya, when I saw the name on a client intake summary and had to read it 3 times before it made sense. Ellison Hardware, Robert Ellison owner, requesting emergency payroll financing and operational restructuring, 41 employees at risk. 41 people I might have known, people whose kids went to my old high school. I sat with that folder open on my desk for a long time. My first instinct, honestly, was to walk away from the deal entirely, hand it to another account manager, stay out of it, keep the wall between my 2 lives intact. But 41 families were on the other side of that decision. And whatever my father was, whatever he'd made me feel for 9 years, he wasn't the only person who'd lose something if this fell apart. I called Priya into my office and told her, for the first time in 7 years, the truth about my last name. She didn't laugh. She didn't gasp. She just leaned back in her chair and said, "Well, that explains the Civic." We made a decision together that afternoon. I would stay involved in the deal, but off the front line. Priya would run point on every call, every meeting, exactly like always. If it came time for final sign-off, the kind that required the actual CEO, I would be there, not before. I told myself it was strategy. Some part of me knew it was also 9 years of waiting for exactly this moment, dressed up as strategy. Over the next 3 weeks, Priya and our finance team ran the numbers on Ellison Hardware from the inside every register report, every supplier invoice, every scheduling gap. I read every summary she sent me at night, at my kitchen table, in the house my family still thought was a rental. I found out things about my father's business that broke my heart a little. He'd been paying 2 employees, Denny at the Route 9 store, and an older woman named Fran who'd worked the register for 11 years, entirely out of his own pocket for the last 4 months, quietly, so their families wouldn't lose income while the store scraped by. Nobody in our family knew that. He never once mentioned it at dinner. He never once took credit. It didn't erase 9 years of the computer thing, but it complicated the villain I'd built him into in my head, and complicated things are always the ones worth telling honestly. I also found the thing that would matter most in the final meeting, buried in an old supplier contract from 6 years back. A clause my father had signed that locked Ellison Hardware into an exclusivity deal with a regional distributor at nearly double market rate, the actual root of most of the store's margin collapse. Trevor had flagged this exact clause in an internal memo 18 months earlier. My father had ignored it. Everything I needed for the final decision was sitting right there in the paperwork. I just needed to be in the room. The final meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning, in Norlight's second-floor conference room, the one with our logo on the glass door. The one my father had walked past twice already without a flicker of recognition, because he'd never once looked up my company's name. I asked Priya to seat me at the far end of the table, introduced only as our CEO, no first name given out loud, badge turned face down on the table in front of me. I wanted to hear what my father would say about his daughter when he thought his daughter wasn't in the room. I didn't have to wait long. 15 minutes in, discussing repayment terms, my father got frustrated with a clause Priya proposed a modest equity stake in exchange for absorbing the store's payroll risk for 18 months. Standard. Fair, honestly, given how much risk we'd be taking on. This is exactly the kind of thing my daughter would have talked me into, he said, not to me, to Priya, shaking his head. She never understood real business. Dropped out, went off to play with computers. Thinks equity and ownership are the same thing as a paycheck. He let out a short laugh. At least Trevor here actually finished something in his life. Trevor, to his credit, looked uncomfortable. He shifted in his seat and said quietly, "Dad, come on." My father waved him off. "I'm just saying, if Maren had listened to me at 20, she'd have a real job right now, instead of whatever she's doing. Some kind of app support, I think." I sat at the far end of the table, badge turned face down, and felt something in my chest that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. It was closer to clarity. 9 years of the computer thing, and he still didn't know, still hadn't asked, still couldn't be bothered to find out what his own daughter had built with the years he'd written off. Priya glanced at me once, barely, a question in her eyes. I gave the smallest nod. She set down her pen. "Mr. Ellison," she said, "before we finalize terms, I think it's time you met the person actually making this decision." I turned my badge over. My father looked at the badge, then at my face, and I watched 9 years rearrange themselves behind his eyes in real time. "Maren." His voice came out smaller than I'd ever heard it. This is your company?" "I founded it 9 years ago," I said. "The same year you told me I was throwing away a real future." Trevor had gone very still, staring at me like he was doing math he didn't have the numbers for yet. My mother wasn't in the room, but I found out later he called her the second he left the building, and she cried on the phone for 20 minutes, not from sadness, she told me, but from the sheer disorientation of realizing she'd spent 9 years feeling sorry for the wrong daughter. My father didn't say anything for a long moment, then quietly, "Why didn't you tell us?" I could have said a dozen things. I could have said because you never asked. I could have said because I watched what your approval did to Trevor, and I didn't want it doing that to me. Instead, I told him the truest thing I had. Because for 9 years, nobody in this family wanted to know who I actually was. You wanted the version of me that confirmed what you'd already decided. I stopped trying to correct that a long time ago. He looked down at the table, at the contract still open in front of him, and now you're the one deciding if we survive. "Yes," I said, "and I'm going to help you, not because you deserve an apology-shaped rescue, because 41 families work for you. And Denny and Fran have been carrying your business on their backs for 4 months while you kept it quiet, and because whatever you think of me, I don't let people go under when I have the ability to stop it." We restructured the deal that same week. Norlight absorbed the payroll risk for 18 months, took a modest equity position, and, at my insistence, wrote the old exclusivity clause completely out of their supplier contracts, saving the store nearly 11% in margin going forward. Trevor, it turned out, had been right about that clause the whole time. I made sure my father heard that from me directly, in the same room, so he couldn't quietly forget it the way he'd quietly forgotten everything else that didn't fit the story he told about his kids. Denny and Fran got back pay within 2 weeks. My father didn't ask for credit for having covered them himself. I gave it to him anyway, once, out loud, in front of Trevor, because it was true, and because it was the only piece of that meeting that didn't need correcting. Things with my parents are not fixed. I want to be honest about that, because I don't think tidy endings are honest ones. My mother calls more now, asks real questions, sometimes even writes them down beforehand so she gets the terminology right, which is its own kind of apology. My father is quieter with me than he used to be, not cold, just careful, like a man recalculating 9 years of assumptions, one conversation at a time. Trevor and I talk more than we ever have. He asked me, a few weeks ago, if Norlight was hiring anyone with an unfinished MBA and a decent eye for supply contracts. I told him I'd think about it. I meant it. I still drive the Civic. Some habits aren't about hiding anymore. Some are just mine. Here's what I keep coming back to. My family spent 9 years measuring me by the one thing I'd walked away from, and never once asked what I'd walked toward. I don't think that makes them monsters. I think it makes them human and a little incurious, and very used to a version of the world where their assumptions didn't have to survive contact with the truth. Mine finally did. If you've ever been the failure in a room full of people who never bothered to ask what you were actually building, I want you to hear this. Their version of you is not a debt you owe them. Keep building. Let the truth introduce itself when it's ready. That's my story. If it made you feel something, anger, relief, a little bit of both, tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if this stayed with you, share it with someone who's been underestimated by the people who should have known better. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. See you in the next.